The transatlantic slave trade is a period of history that stirs up a lot of emotions, and rightfully so. It's hard to comprehend the amount of suffering it caused. But when we talk about this dark period of our past, we can get lost in the details and lose sight of the big picture. And what's the big picture? Simply put, it's all about power and money. That's right, everything boils down to two things. If you want to understand the slave trade, you have to look at it through the eyes of the people who made it happen, the Europeans. Now, you might be wondering, why do we need to look at it from their perspective? Well, because they were the ones in control, and that gave them the power to shape how the world viewed Africans. They stripped us of our humanity, turning us into commodities to be bought and sold just like any other product. So let's take a step back and try to see things from their point of view. You might not like what you hear, but it's crucial to understand how they saw the world. You see, when the Europeans started exploring and conquering the Americas, they needed a way to make money. It wasn't easy, let me tell you. There was no system in place for exploiting the resources or labor of the land, and that made it challenging to establish a profitable economy. What they needed was someone to harness the resources and produce goods that could generate wealth. And that's where Africans came in. The Europeans believed it was their God-given right to rule over other races. It was called the white man's burden. To them, it was a duty bestowed upon them by God to spread Christianity and civilization among the heathens of Africa. They thought they were superior in every way, smarter, more advanced, and destined to lead the rest of the world. But it wasn't just about religion. The real motivation here was greed. Let me explain. When the Europeans arrived in the Americas, they quickly realized that the indigenous people didn't have much interest in the type of work the Europeans wanted them to do. For example, planting and harvesting crops or taking care of livestock. It took a Herculean effort to set up plantations and farms in the New World. The Europeans were not willing to do the hard work themselves, especially when there was an alternative, using enslaved Africans. Before long, the Europeans had developed a taste for luxury, and they were not about to sacrifice their comfort to build empires. No way, so they started capturing and enslaving Africans and brought them to the Americas. The number of enslaved Africans who crossed the Atlantic during the slave trade is staggering, around 12.5 million. That's a truly horrifying figure, isn't it? These men, women, and children were stripped of their freedom and forced to work in conditions you wouldn't believe. It was pure evil. Now, let's imagine that we are Europeans in the 17th century. We've established a sugar plantation in the West Indies, and it's clear we don't want to work ourselves. The indigenous population has already been decimated by diseases we brought with us, and the work still needs to be done. Our options are limited. We could pay people to work, but we know those folks would prefer to work for us than be out in the hot sun all day. Plus, it's cheaper to buy someone than to pay someone for their services, don't you think? Or we could rely on convicts. But you know what they say, right? Convicts gonna convict. So now our third option is Africans. We've heard stories of their endurance and strength, and we know they're expendable. There's plenty of them and no shortage of slave catchers. And that's how it all started. The transatlantic slave trade was no accident. It was a well-calculated move based on the greed and insatiable appetite for power. Those who profited from the slave trade grew wealthy off the backs of our ancestors. And even after it was abolished, they didn't feel any remorse. You see, once they started making money off our bodies, they convinced themselves that it was God's will. They created a system that allowed them to keep buying and selling human beings without feeling guilty. Let me share a quote with you from one of those people, John Locke. He said, "All mankind is divided into those who have need of others, and those who are fit to be employed by others, and this puts them naturally into a state of servitude one to another." Wow, right? Can you believe that? He actually believed that some people were born to be enslaved. Think about how messed up that is. Now let's talk about the impact this thinking had on Africans. It changed everything. Our languages, customs, and ways of life were seen as primitive and inferior, we were labeled uncivilized and barbaric. And they used this narrative to justify their actions. Let me give you an example. The Europeans claimed that Africans were better off as slaves because it gave them a chance to escape a harsh existence. Talk about twisted logic. They said it was a blessing for Africans to be enslaved because it meant they wouldn't have to deal with hunger and poverty anymore. Can you imagine the audacity? To make matters worse, they created fake stories about Africans, saying we weren't real people, that we didn't have souls. And then they compared us to animals. Imagine how that must have felt, being treated as if you're less than human. All this propaganda aimed to convince people that enslaving Africans was the right thing to do. It's hard to fathom the depths of their cruelty, but that's the truth. The effects of this propaganda are still felt today. The idea that Africans were cursed or destined to be enslaved stuck around for a long time. It wasn't until recently that we started challenging these false beliefs and showing the world that Africans are not cursed. We are strong, resilient people with a rich culture and history. But it wasn't just our culture that they tried to destroy. Africans as a whole were targeted. We were branded as lazy and unintelligent, and they refused to teach us skills that could help us improve our lives. It was as if they wanted to keep us as ignorant as possible. Why, you ask? Simple. Because ignorance makes it easier to control people. When Europeans began exploring and conquering new lands in the 15th century, they brought along a deadly weapon: diseases. Smallpox, measles, and yellow fever ravaged African populations, killing millions before they even had a chance to fight back. It's tragic but true, and the Europeans knew this, which is why they didn't bother teaching Africans advanced skills. They didn't want us to become smarter and stronger, because then we might have stood a chance against them. Imagine living in a world where you were constantly belittled and told you were not capable of great things. That's what Africans went through for centuries, but we didn't give up. We found ways to learn and grow, even if it meant hiding our knowledge from the very people who were trying to keep us down. What's really mind-blowing is how deeply ingrained this thinking is in the minds of Europeans. Even after slavery was abolished, they still held onto these beliefs. It wasn't easy for them to accept that Africans were equal. And that brings us to the present day. You see, it wasn't just about enslaving Africans. It was about erasing our identity and replacing it with theirs. But here's the thing. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't erase our culture completely. Sure, they forced us to convert to Christianity and outlawed our traditional religions. They also banned our languages, forcing us to learn theirs instead. But despite all that, our culture survived. In places like Brazil and the Caribbean, our music, dances, and foods mixed with the local flavors, creating something entirely new. It's like a beautiful blend of cultures. And this fusion happened because no matter how much they tried to change us, we held onto our roots. But the story doesn't end there. While some Africans embraced Christianity, many others kept their faith alive in secret, passing down their beliefs from one generation to the next. It's a testament to their strength and determination. And then there's resistance. From the moment Africans were brought to the Americas, we started fighting back. I'm talking about revolts, rebellions, and acts of defiance. We didn't just accept our fate, we resisted. Some of us ran away, escaping to remote areas where we built our own communities. Others fought, taking arms into their own hands to challenge the system. And then there were those who led massive revolts, like the Haitian Revolution that ended slavery in Haiti. It's important to remember that while Africans were portrayed as submissive and obedient, we were far from it. We were warriors, leaders, and thinkers, and we proved it time and time again. So, brothers and sisters, the transatlantic slave trade was indeed a dark chapter in history. But we have to remember that it wasn't just about Africans. It was about the corruption of entire nations and the loss of innocent lives. It was about greed, power, and the thirst for wealth. Understanding this helps us see how the slave trade affected everyone involved, both positively and negatively. The Atlantic slave trade stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. And among the regions most profoundly affected by this horrific enterprise was the area known as the Slave Coast. Stretching along parts of what is now Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, the Slave Coast was transformed into one of the largest exporters of enslaved people in the world. This infamous reputation had a profound impact on every aspect of life there. So in today's video, we're going to explore how the slave trade devastated the Slave Coast. But before we dive into this heartbreaking topic, please support us by hitting that like button, subscribing, and turning on notifications so that you never miss any of our thought-provoking videos. Let's begin. Before the emergence of the transatlantic slave trade, the area we today call the Slave Coast was home to a number of flourishing kingdoms and societies. The most prominent among them were the Dahomey, Oyo, and Alauda kingdoms. These states were engaged in agriculture, producing crops like yams, cassava, and maize, which sustained their populations and formed the basis of their economies. They also participated in regional trade networks, exchanging goods such as ivory, gold, and cowrie shells, which served as currency. The people of the Slave Coast were known for their skill in craftsmanship, producing items like pottery, textiles, and metalwork that were not only used locally, but also traded with other regions. Their societies were complex and well-organized. Political authority was often concentrated in the hands of kings or emperors who were considered the supreme leaders of their respective domains. Below the monarchs was a hierarchy of nobles, chiefs, and counselors who assisted in governance and maintained order. Despite the differences among them, these societies shared common cultural traits. They had a deep respect for elders and ancestors, which influenced their social structure and decision-making processes. Religion played a vital role in their daily lives. They believed in a supreme being who was often seen as the creator and ruler of the universe. This belief system shaped their worldview and moral values. However, the arrival of European traders in the 15th century marked the beginning of a horrifying chapter in their history. The transatlantic slave trade had far-reaching consequences for the demographics, economy, gender roles, and even the psychology of the people on the Slave Coast. Let's delve deeper into each of these aspects. First and foremost, the slave trade led to a massive depopulation of the Slave Coast. Millions of people were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean to work in the Americas, primarily in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the southern United States. This drastic reduction in population not only emptied the coast of its people, but also dismantled families and communities. Entire villages could be wiped out in a single raid or an attack. For example, in the Kingdom of Dahomey, the king kept a standing army whose sole purpose was to conduct slave raids. The kingdom's wealth and power depended on capturing and selling prisoners of war and criminals into slavery. Over time, the slave trade grew increasingly brutal, leading to the targeting of entire communities. The Atlantic slave trade is estimated to have transported over 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Of these, it is believed that approximately 3 million were from the Slave Coast. To put this into perspective, the population of New York City is around 8 million people. Therefore, if you can imagine the entire population of New York being decimated 3 times, you can begin to understand the scale of the tragedy that befell the Slave Coast. But it wasn't just about numbers, it was about the loss of individual lives, the tearing apart of families, and the destruction of communities. It's important to remember that behind the statistics were real people with hopes, dreams, and loved ones. The demographics shifted dramatically with the slave trade, leading to an imbalance in population. As mentioned earlier, more men than women were typically taken into slavery. This gender imbalance had ripple effects throughout society, impacting family structures and agricultural production. With the loss of men, women were left to take on new roles and responsibilities, sometimes taking on traditionally male roles. This challenged existing gender norms and created new dynamics within households and communities. The Atlantic slave trade was also deeply entwined with politics, shaping the very nature of power in the region. Local rulers and merchants strategically engaged in the trade to acquire firearms, luxury goods, and most importantly, to gain political power. For instance, the Kingdom of Dahomey emerged as a major player in the slave trade during the 18th century. King Agaja conquered neighboring territories, expanding his empire and acquiring more people to enslave and sell. This led to a proliferation of warfare as different groups sought to capture and dominate others for the sole purpose of obtaining captives for the slave trade. The quest for political power and dominance fueled endless cycles of violence. This instability hindered the region's ability to develop and grow, keeping it trapped in a state of chaos and destruction. Economically, the slave coast became intricately tied to the slave trade. The demand for enslaved people created a lucrative market that drew in merchants and traders from across the coast. Forts and warehouses were built to store captured people before they were shipped across the Atlantic. Although some African elites accumulated wealth and power through the trade, it was a highly exploitative system that ultimately devastated the region. Instead of investing in infrastructure, education, or sustainable industries, societies became focused on capturing and selling people. This distorted their economies, preventing them from building solid foundations for long-term growth and prosperity. The slave trade's impact went beyond the physical and psychological toll on individuals. It deeply affected cultural landscapes, traditions, and beliefs. Entire communities were uprooted, disrupting religious and social practices. Some societies incorporated elements of their captors' religions, leading to syncretic belief systems. For example, the blending of African spiritual beliefs with Christianity or Islam, which were prevalent among European traders, resulted in unique religious expressions. Additionally, the trauma of mass kidnappings and the horrors of the slave trade itself became embedded in oral histories, stories, songs, and proverbs that were passed down through generations. These narratives served as a way to preserve memories, cope with the aftermath of the trade, and also to pass on lessons of resilience and resistance to future generations. The impact of the Atlantic slave trade on the slave coast was truly devastating. It led to widespread death, unimaginable suffering, and the destruction of societies. However, it's important to note that despite the horrors they endured, the people of the slave coast displayed incredible resilience. They adapted, resisted, and preserved their cultures in the face of overwhelming adversity. Their stories are a testament to the strength and spirit of humanity in the face of unimaginable challenges. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific chapter in history that should never be forgotten. By understanding its impact on the slave coast, we gain a deeper appreciation for the struggles and resilience of those who endured this dark period. It is a reminder of the importance of fighting against injustice, promoting equality, and ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more insightful content. They took away everything we had, our freedom, our dignity, our identity. But there was one thing they couldn't take away, our spirit. We resisted in any way we could, rebelling against our captors, defying our oppressors. And in doing so, we not only survived, but also found strength in unity, hope in solidarity, and freedom in each other. Welcome to this channel. And today, as we embark on a profound journey through the harrowing experience of the Middle Passage, the infamous crossing of the Atlantic Ocean by enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, we will unveil the harrowing reality of this voyage, shedding light on the unimaginable horrors that unfolded on board the slave ships. From the forced departure from Africa to their arrival in the Americas, we will explore the multitude of ways in which these resilient individuals fought back against their captors. In the 16th century, the transatlantic slave trade began with the Portuguese leading the way in transporting African slaves to the New World. By the 18th century, it flourished, with European powers actively participating in capturing, transporting, and selling fellow humans across the Atlantic. and the journey became known as the Middle Passage. Millions of Africans were brutally ripped away from their homes, forced into overcrowded ships where their lives became a gamble. Many never even saw the New World because their lives were snuffed out during this journey. This horrific enterprise kicked off with the capture of Africans deep within the continent. Enslavers descended from nomadic groups with distinct languages and traditions. They were kidnapped and thrust together, forming a melting pot of cultures on those fateful ships. Kidnapping and the transport from Africa's interior to the coasts marked the beginning of the suffering. Before they even set foot on slave ships, many Africans were captured in violent raids carried out by local kingdoms or slave traders in collaboration with Europeans. They were then forced on long, grueling marches, chained together under the scorching sun or heavy rain, without sufficient food or water. Many died before reaching the coast, while the survivors were herded into horrific holding forts, where they remained for weeks or months in dehumanizing conditions that claimed the lives of the weak and sick. This is vividly depicted in Olaudah Equiano's narrative. He writes, "The horrid stench of so many human bodies in a state of putrefaction almost choked me. Numbers of the sick and dying were carried on board the ship. No attention was paid to the cleanliness of the living, nor the dead were ever taken off. All died. The horrible pestilence continued to make sad havoc among us, and the shrieks of the dying were a constant terror to the survivors. When the time for shipping came, Africans were forced aboard slave ships. Their chains were temporarily loosened just to drag themselves to the holds below deck. Here, the nightmare intensified. The conditions in the holds were a grotesque blend of misery and despair. Enslaved people were confined by the thousands in dark, cramped spaces that were designed to hold just a fraction of their numbers. Men, women, and children were packed together shoulder to shoulder, barely able to move or stretch their limbs. It was a fate worse than death. Unable to stand upright, they spent their days and nights in a sitting position, enduring the stench of stale waste and the unbearable weight of the sky. Above their heads, the incessant drip of seawater added a haunting melody to their grim situation. Sometimes the cramped quarters claimed lives, and the dying were left to decay right where they sat, adding to the unbearable stench. When the ship hit rough waters, the stench grew heavier, sometimes causing even the strong and healthy to faint from its intensity. Any attempt to escape this suffocating environment was futile. The walls of the hold were smooth and slick, offering no handholds or footholds to help anyone climb out. Food and water were scarce, with the enslaved receiving just enough to stay alive. It was a cruel strategy employed by slave traders to keep the price of their cargo high. Malnutrition and lack of clean water led to widespread sickness. Diseases like dysentery, smallpox, and skin infections spread like wildfire in this unsanitary environment. The air itself seemed to carry sickness. The lack of sunlight made it impossible for the body to produce vitamin D, weakening the immune system and making them more susceptible to ailments. The darkness also played tricks on their minds, turning familiar faces into menacing figures. Paranoia ran rampant, as did self-harm and suicide. Desperate to escape the horror, some refused food, leading to brutal force-feeding or torture. Others jumped into the sea, preferring a watery grave to life on the ship. Despite all this, prisoners weren't completely without agency. Acts of defiance dotted this grim voyage. Africans resisted individually and collectively. Some refused to eat, protesting against their captors and preserving their dignity. Others formed bonds of camaraderie, finding solace and strength in shared stories and songs. Spirituals, a genre of music born out of the African-American experience, found its roots here. These songs were more than just music. They were vessels of hope, resilience, and resistance. They carried messages of faith, liberation, and remembrance of the homeland. For instance, Wade in the Water instructed fellow runaways to avoid detection by leaving footprints only in the water, showing both ingenuity and resourcefulness. Spirituals served as a communal activity, binding the enslaved together and fostering a sense of unity and purpose. Spirituals also functioned as a tool for preserving cultural identity. Amidst the horrors of the Middle Passage, they kept alive the rhythms, melodies, and stories of their homeland, reinforcing a sense of community and continuity. During the Middle Passage, Africans exhibited remarkable acts of courage and resistance despite the appalling conditions. Uprisings were frequent, though often brutally crushed. Rebellions like the one led by Mingo, Senghor, Cudjoe, and Gonu aimed to seize control of ships or simply cause havoc, demonstrating the indomitable spirit of the enslaved. Despite facing unimaginable hardships, Africans never surrendered their humanity. Acts of kindness and mutual support flourished, with mothers shielding their children, friends comforting the sick and elderly, and strangers bonding over their shared adversity. Moreover, many captives clung to their religious beliefs, finding solace in prayer and faith. Leaders like the Muslim preacher, Yusuf Karichu, kept spirits high and offered guidance during the darkest moments. Their presence provided a beacon of hope in an ocean of despair. The captives also engaged in acts of civil disobedience, such as refusing to eat or work, to express their dissent and assert their humanity. For example, the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina involved dozens of enslaved Africans who revolted against their masters, marching nearly 100 miles to freedom. While ultimately unsuccessful, the rebellion highlighted the simmering discontent and desire for liberty among the enslaved. In conclusion, the Middle Passage was a horrifying chapter in human history, but it was also a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. The bravery and resistance displayed by the enslaved Africans serve as a powerful reminder of their determination to overcome even the darkest of adversities. As we reflect on this painful legacy, let us honor the memory of those who suffered during the Middle Passage by working towards a more just and equitable world. Let their stories continue to inspire us to challenge injustice and fight for the rights and dignity of all people. That concludes our journey through the horrors of the Middle Passage. If you found this video informative, please consider liking it and sharing it. Your engagement helps us continue producing quality content. Also, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Each subscription brings us closer to our goal of reaching a wider audience with our historical narratives. Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time. As we step into the 16th century, our world is on the brink of a dramatic transformation. European nations, invigorated by ambitious spirits of exploration and conquest, are establishing colonies across the globe. But as they set about building their empires, a pressing question arises: who will do the backbreaking work required to sustain these far-flung settlements? This question would lead to one of the most disturbing chapters in human history, the Transatlantic Slave Trade. So let's dive into this sad chapter of human history. Welcome to the channel, and today, let's find out how did European colonies' labor needs influence the growth of the slave trade. Picture the scene. It's the early 1500s, and the Spanish and Portuguese are venturing further into the Caribbean and South America. They've stumbled upon lands rich in resources, perfect for establishing colonies. But they quickly encounter a major roadblock. The indigenous people, the natives, are not suited for the grueling work required on plantations or in the mines. The natives were accustomed to a different way of life and weren't interested in working long hours for European wages. And to make matters worse, many of them had already fallen victim to deadly diseases brought over by Europeans, which devastated their population. Faced with dwindling labor forces, Europeans found themselves at a critical crossroads. They needed a large, hardy workforce, immune to European diseases, that could endure the hardships of life in the New World. But where could they possibly find such people? Fast forward to West Africa. Here we see a thriving population with a robust immune system that had already been exposed to many of the diseases that ravaged Europe. The climate, though hot, was similar enough to the conditions in the New World that European settlers believed Africans would be able to adapt. And so the idea of transporting Africans to the Americas as laborers began to take shape. But why exactly were Europeans so desperate for labor? What was it about the Americas that required such a large workforce? The answer lies in the very nature of the colonies themselves. The European vision for their American colonies was rooted in profit. They envisioned vast plantations producing high-value crops like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. These crops were not only highly profitable in the European markets, but were also staples of the growing consumer culture in Europe. The demand for these products was ever increasing, which meant that the colonies had to produce more and more to meet that demand. But agriculture was hard, monotonous work, especially in the unforgiving heat of the tropical climate. Europeans who had grown accustomed to a more leisurely lifestyle back home were not willing to do this kind of work. They saw it as menial and beneath their status. And so the idea of African slave labor began to take root in their minds. Let's shift our focus to the Portuguese colony of Brazil in the 1550s. The Portuguese were eager to capitalize on the lucrative sugar market. They began establishing sugar plantations on an unprecedented scale. But the labor shortage was a serious issue. Local Brazilian laborers were scarce, and the few natives who could be persuaded to work were quickly exploited to the point of near extinction. This was when the Portuguese, along with other Europeans, turned to Africa. They began capturing and transporting Africans to work on their plantations. Initially, many of these Africans were captured in tribal wars and sold to the Portuguese. But as demand for labor increased, so did the need for a steady supply of captives. This led to the horrific practice of slave raids, where Europeans and their African allies would attack villages, kidnap people, and sell them into slavery. This dark chapter marked the beginning of a terrible trade that would cast a long shadow over our history. In the coming decades, the transatlantic slave trade would grow exponentially, fueled by the insatiable demand for labor on European plantations. By the 17th century, thousands of Africans were being kidnapped every year and transported across the Atlantic in cramped, inhumane conditions. The infamous Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas, was a harrowing experience. Africans were packed into ships like sardines, enduring horrific conditions that claimed countless lives. Of those who survived the journey, a new life of hardship awaited them on the plantations. Their days were filled with backbreaking work under the scorching sun. The nights offered little respite as they slept in crowded quarters with other slaves. European colonizers created a brutal system where slaves were treated as property, bought and sold for profit. Families were torn apart and individuals were branded, whipped, and shackled for any perceived act of disobedience. This dehumanizing treatment inflicted deep psychological wounds that echoed for generations. As the demand for tropical goods like sugar, tobacco, and cotton surged in Europe, so did the need for slaves. The slave trade was no longer an afterthought. It was now the backbone of the colonial economy. Plantations sprawled across the landscape, consuming vast amounts of labor to keep up with production demands. In the Caribbean, for example, sugar plantations were particularly notorious for their high mortality rate among the enslaved. Harsh working conditions and rampant disease led to a high mortality rate. This meant that even with the constant influx of new slaves, the plantations were always short-staffed, leading to an endless cycle of buying more slaves. As a result, the slave trade boomed, connecting the darkest desires of European greed to the misery of African enslavement. But the impact of the slave trade was not limited to the Americas alone. European powers like the Dutch and British also established colonies in the Indian Ocean, including islands like Mauritius and Reunion. These islands became hubs for cultivating spices, coffee, and cotton, mirroring the labor-intensive demands of their American counterparts. And so the slave trade spread its tentacles to Africa, drawing victims from different regions and fueling conflicts and instability across the continent. During this time, some African kingdoms prospered due to their involvement in the slave trade. For instance, the Kingdom of Benin became wealthy by selling other Africans into slavery. However, many African societies suffered greatly. European powers targeted these societies, often using superior weaponry and exploiting internal divisions to conquer them. Once conquered, these societies were subjected to forced labor or were raided for slaves, decimating their populations. The slave trade also sparked conflict between African groups. Some groups allied with Europeans to raid and capture other Africans, driven by greed or a desire for power. This web of alliances and betrayals reshaped the political landscape of Africa, leaving deep scars that resonate even today. Now let's focus on the role that European wars played in intensifying the demand for slaves. During times of conflict, colonies become crucial sources of wealth and power. The French and Indian War, for instance, drained European coffers. To finance their military campaigns, European powers looked to their colonies for financial support. The demand for valuable commodities from the Americas soared, driving the need for more plantation workers. This meant a higher demand for slaves, perpetuating the cycle of the slave trade. The 7 Years' War was another pivotal moment. As European nations clashed, their colonies became strategic assets. The British and French, the primary belligerents, sought to outdo each other in colonial America. This rivalry led to a surge in plantation development, particularly in the southern colonies, where cash crops like tobacco and cotton were cultivated. As plantations expanded, so did the demand for slave labor, contributing significantly to the growth of the transatlantic slave trade during this period. As European demand for tropical goods continued to rise, the transatlantic slave trade burgeoned. By the end of the 18th century, millions of Africans had been forcibly transported across the Atlantic, enduring the horrors of the Middle Passage and facing lifetimes of servitude in the Americas. This staggering human toll is a stark reminder of the brutality and inhumanity at the core of this dark chapter in history. However, this grim narrative is not solely about the suffering of enslaved Africans. It is also a story of European greed and the relentless pursuit of profit. European nations reveled in the wealth generated by the slave trade, amassing fortunes that fueled their industrial revolutions and transformed their economies. The economic impact of the slave trade was so profound that some historians argue that the Industrial Revolution might not have been possible without the immense wealth derived from enslaved labor. Yet amidst this bleak panorama, stories of resistance and resilience offer glimmers of hope. Enslaved Africans resisted in various ways, from rebellions and revolts to acts of defiance and escape. Their courage and determination to fight for freedom serve as powerful testaments to the indomitable spirit of humanity. As we reflect on this dark chapter, it is essential to confront the lasting legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. The economic and social effects of this era continue to reverberate today, shaping racial dynamics and economic disparities across the globe. Acknowledging this history is crucial for understanding the world we live in today and working toward a more equitable future. In conclusion, the growth of the transatlantic slave trade was intricately linked to the labor needs of European colonies. As European powers ventured further into the Americas and the Indian Ocean, they encountered a shortage of labor. The indigenous populations were not suited for the demanding work on plantations or in mines, and Europeans themselves were reluctant to undertake such labor-intensive tasks. This led to the brutal reality of the slave trade, where Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to work under inhumane conditions. Fueled by European demand for tropical goods, the slave trade grew exponentially, resulting in the enslavement of millions. European wars also played a significant role in intensifying the slave trade as colonies became crucial sources of wealth and power during conflicts. This dark chapter in history serves as a reminder of the devastating consequences of greed and the importance of acknowledging our past to build a better future.